So what are the main legal issues that arise for startups? Well, that's what we're going to spend this entire course discussing. But as a general overview, there are several. The first is organizing the enterprise in the most efficient way. By default, there's nothing that prohibits individuals or groups of individuals from operating a business. But if and when that business incurs any liabilities or debts, the owner or owners of that business are responsible personally. This causes a lot of risk for owners of businesses that they would rather not have to carry. And that in turn disincentivizes people from entering into businesses. So to incentivize people to pursue business activities by eliminating the risk that their personal assets could be called to fulfill any obligations that the business may incur, we've developed a body of corporate law or business association law. So there are many options available to entrepreneurs or people who want to launch startups about how to organize the business, legally speaking, so as to protect themselves from personal liability and still take best advantage of what the law offers them. So we're going to talk about many different options that are available and what are the pros and cons of those options and what traditionally lawyers for startups do when it comes to organizing the business. After the business is organized, then the next most important thing to do is to fund the business, to get some financing. If the founder or founders aren't independently wealthy and can't fund the business themselves, they're going to have to find outside support, either from angels or friends and families and fools or venture capitalists, like we talked about previously. All of that type of financing activity triggers securities laws. And we're going to go over some of the history of securities laws, why we have them, what they do, and how they apply to startups when they're trying to raise capital for their businesses. Brian told us the story of using credit cards and selling cereal, but eventually the goal was to get some real institutional investment. After a startup has received investment, the first thing they do typically, or the most important thing they do, or what they spend most of their money on, is talented individuals who can contribute effort to accomplishing the goals of the business. So the next most important thing, legally speaking, is talent legal issues. It's not just employment, because you can retain talented people who do work for a business as independent contractors or as advisors or as board members. So there's lots of different roles that individuals can play with a business other than employees. So we're going to talk about that, but we also are going to talk about some specific employment rules that apply. Now, there's a big issue right now with whether or not the drivers of Uber and the drivers of Lyft are independent contractors or employees, and we'll talk about that as well. Now, once you've retained talent, what is it that they do for a startup? Well, we don't have startups that are mining gold from mountains or producing hard assets. Generally, what talented people do for a startup is create intellectual property. So they come up with good ideas, secrets about how to operate the business efficiently. That is protected by one form of intellectual property, trade secrets. They might also come up with branding and names for the business that's protected by trademark. They may come up with original works of authorship for the business, so some writings or other audiovisual content, which gets protected by copyright law as well as software. And finally, they have inventions that could be protected by patents. So our role as attorneys when working with startups is to help them harness the intellectual property laws that are available to capture and protect the assets of the business. This can contribute to the value of the business and also help protect the business from competitors. We'll get into that when we talk about intellectual property. Then once a startup has operational capacity, it actually starts having users and customers and suppliers. It starts entering into relationships with other people that could lead to a substantial amount of risk. So we're going to talk about how best to manage and mitigate that risk so that startups don't have a catastrophe happen legally that threatens the business from continuing. In addition to private party risk, a lot of startups also have regulatory risk. So whether it's Airbnb threatening the hotel industry, or Uber threatening the taxi cab industry, or cannabis companies, or virtual currency companies, or online sports betting companies, there's all sorts of startups that when they launch, part of why they seek to capture a large market is because they want to disrupt some currently entrenched players. Well, that disruption that threatens the current industry can often lead to a lot of regulatory pushback because the current industry often is cozy with the regulators. So, for example, in Miami Beach, there are stories of people who've rented their apartments out on Airbnb getting $20,000 fines as a first instance. And that high fine is a result of Miami Beach, the government of Miami Beach being very much cozy with the hotel industry, which sees Airbnb as a huge threat. So we'll talk about risk issues and regulation issues as well. After that, a startup will exit. All startups exit. Some exit successfully through acquisition or initial public offering, and most exit unsuccessfully through ceasing operations. Not necessarily bankruptcy, maybe in some cases there's bankruptcy, but other cases they just die and go out of business. And some startups pivot. They go from one business activity to a completely different one. We'll talk about all those various types of exits and what the legal ramifications are of those. Finally, we'll talk about social entrepreneurship, which is a specific version of entrepreneurship used to achieve more than just a profit goal. So social entrepreneurs aren't necessarily not-for-profit. There can be for-profit social entrepreneurs. So we'll talk about all the various business models that exist for social entrepreneurship and what legal issues they trigger as well. Finally, we'll close the course on professional responsibility issues. There's a lot of areas in which working with startups as an attorney can cause problems. And so you need to make sure as an attorney you're aware of the rules of professional responsibility and abiding by them in your representation. So we'll spend some time going over those as well. Okay, so what is life like as a startup lawyer? You know, some people may think that it's exciting. You're working with these startup companies, you're working with Airbnb, you're working with Uber. It's really exciting. There's lots of fun stuff going on. And while that may be true on some aspects, it's also very stressful. Your client wants to grow as quickly as possible. And sometimes that doesn't align with what's most legally prudent. So for example, assume you were the lawyer working at Airbnb when Brian came to you and said, we want to launch our website for use in Miami Beach. And you did your work and you did your research. You said, Brian, that's going to be a real big problem because Miami Beach doesn't allow Airbnb. And if we have people in Miami Beach using Airbnb, they're going to get fines. So your advice as a lawyer is going to be, don't move into Miami Beach. But Brian's response as an entrepreneur is, we have to move into Miami Beach. That's a great business opportunity for us. And we're going to have to figure out how to deal with those issues. So as an attorney at a startup or representing startups, you may find yourself in these uncomfortable situations where you're advising the client about what's the most legally prudent thing to do, and that doesn't align with what's the best business thing for them to do. And so it can be highly stressful. Unlike litigators who have scheduling orders and know well in advance when they have certain deadlines and can always ask for extensions, that doesn't exist in the startup world, the corporate transactional world. Everything is due immediately. Lawsuits can last for years and years and years. Corporate deals don't. The longest corporate deals I've ever heard of lasted a few months. And yet they can be worth just as much, if not more, than litigation. They can have just as many lawyers working on them as a litigation, and yet they have to be done overnight. And so there will be many times as a corporate transactional startup lawyer where you will work nonstop. It's not like litigation. Maybe the closest thing that's on par with litigation is when you're on trial and you're in trial all day and then at night you're preparing for the next day. But trials don't last that long, maybe a couple of weeks at the longest. And deals are not like that. So being a startup lawyer is very stressful, very demanding. The New York Times actually had this article from a few years ago about a very successful Silicon Valley startup lawyer who died as a result of a drug overdose. And this article really goes into depth about the problems that he suffered. And the New York Times used him as an archetype for this problem with lawyers. And the key point I want you to take away from this is they didn't find a litigator to use as their example. They found a corporate startup lawyer as their example of a stressed out lawyer who let the stress destroy their life. This article highlights some interesting facts here that 21% of lawyers qualify as problem drinkers, 28% struggle with mild or more serious depression, 19% struggle with anxiety. This was interesting. Only 3,000 lawyers answered questions about drug use, right? And they had asked 12,000 lawyers. So out of 12,000 lawyers they asked questions to, only 3,000 even answered the questions about drug abuse. And as this study's author says, it leads to speculation. Why would 75% attorneys not answer questions about drug use if the answer was they didn't use drugs? So down here about drugs, 5 of those that did answer, of those 25% that answered, 5% used cocaine, crack, and stimulants, 5% used opioids, 10% used marijuana and hash, and nearly 16% used sedatives. 85% of all the lawyer surveys had used alcohol in the previous year. And this compares only 65% of the general population. So this is a serious topic. You know, it sounds fun. I'm going to work for startups. It's exciting. But I can tell you from experience, and I can cite you other articles in addition to this one, it's a very stressful thing. So when you're in law school and this is a career you're considering, you need to think about how are you going to deal with the stress? How are you going to not let the demands of the profession cause you to make bad choices that could have a very severely negative impact on your life? You know, and this type of pressure isn't just on the lawyers that work at startups. It's on almost everyone that works at startups. Here's Elon Musk, one of the most successful entrepreneurs of our time. He was part of the PayPal mafia, and now he's the head of Tesla and SpaceX. You know, there's a person on Twitter who says, you know, following Elon Musk on Instagram shows an amazing life. I wonder if the ups and downs he had to make for a more enjoyable life. And Elon responds, the reality is there's great highs, terrible lows, and unrelenting stress. Don't think people want to hear about the last two. And that's pretty spot on. So I don't say any of this to deter you from being a startup lawyer. I love being a startup lawyer. I wouldn't trade it for anything. I would never want to be in a courtroom or litigate. I love being a transactional corporate lawyer. I just want to keep it 100 and make sure that you understand this is a very stressful, demanding career. It's not relaxing and easy. It's rewarding. It enables you to have a great life for you, your family, and your loved ones. But it is not an easy, simple life.